The last poem that we did, that is by Wally Shoinka, Telephone Conversation, was by a Nobel recipient. And today again we have from Rhapsody yet another poem by the 1995 Nobel recipient Seamus Heaney, and the poem is Death of a Naturalist. When I first read this poem, Death of a Naturalist, I felt revolted, a feeling of disgust. And I read it a second time and I was fascinated. And yet again, when I read it, I was amazed and astounded at the depth and beauty of this poem. I think it is a poem that a literature student needs to read over and over. So let's go into the poem. All year the flax-dam festered in the heat of the townland. Green and heavy-headed, flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. So the poet begins by telling us about the flax-dam. It's not an actual dam, but the flax-dam is a piece of muddy water or patch of muddy water in which these flax plants, this flax is lying or rotting or decomposing so that it can be used by the farmers later to make fabric, something beautiful. Fabric is going to come out of these seeds. But all year, it stays and it is decaying and rotting slowly. So in the very beginning, something that we notice here is the use of so many negative words: festered, rotted, weighted, sweltered, punishing, sun. All these are very rough and negative words. So festered is like a wound that is, becoming septic. Or rotted is something decaying, decomposing. I think we can already get an auditory image of that rotting, horrible smell, and also a visual image of how it looks. These huge sods of this plant are weighted down, the poet says they are weighted down by the sweltering, hot, punishing sun. The sun is punishing. So we feel here a mental and physical anguish, a mental and physical discomfort by these words. Bubbles gargled delicately, bluebottles wove a strong gauze of sound among the smell. They were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, and best of all was the warm, thick slobber of Frogspawn that grew like clotted water. So now we come to a little more positive language, that is dragonflies and butterflies. Nature, life. The beauty of nature and life is now being appreciated in the next two lines. And this is a particular seed that is edible. It has a kind of blue flowers come on this plant. So now we are going more into what it is and the part that nature plays. And best of all was the warm, thick slobber of Frogspawn that grew like clotted water. So here the poet is using such amazing adjectives like warm, thick, slobber. All of it makes us feel so heavy when you think about it. Clotted makes it like, blood is stuck somewhere and it's clotted. These are all very thick images. Frogspawn is the frog spawn is what is going to become the tadpole. So the mother frog has laid the eggs, it later becomes tadpole, and it later on becomes the adult frog. So life cycle is also mentioned here. Now the poet is telling us that he is going back into his childhood. Once upon a time, when he had visited this flax-dam and collected the frog spawn. In the shade of the banks here every spring, I would fill jampotfuls of the jars of the jellied specks to range on windowsills at home. I would take jam pots and I would fill this jellied, beautiful kiddish children's words are coming. It's a jam pot. This child is taking a jam pot, he's rushing to the flax-dam. He is taking the Frogspawn, putting it in it, and taking it home and putting it on the windowsill. And he says that there are little specks to range on my windowsills at home, on shelves at school, even in the shelves, as a a student who is so interested in nature, in science. He is taking these jam pots, keeping it in his school, and wait and watch. He's waiting and watching with all the enthusiasm, the thrill of a little child. He's waiting to see it turn into tadpoles. The fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. They change into the nimble, fast swimming tadpoles. So now we see how, in the beginning, it is the view of an adult who is going back into his memories, looking back at the flax dam, feeling that it is so revolting, disgusting, rotting. And then he goes back into his childhood, and we see the flax dam through the eyes of a child. And all that the child sees there is something that is teeming with a life. Frogspawn that is going to become tadpoles tomorrow. Then he now goes on to tell us about his teacher. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was Frogspawn. So now he goes back into his class, his biology class, where his teacher was teaching him about the facts of life. And that too is presented with the innocence of a child. This child is telling that, teacher told us that Daddy Frog, this is an Irish poet, and he is using that colloquial usage of daddy and mammy, which is very much used by the little children. It is a colloquial Irish word. And he says, for mother and father, he says how my teacher told us that the daddy frog is also called a bullfrog. He would come and croak, and then mammy frog would lay hundreds of eggs, and this was called Frogspawn. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in the rain. So the teacher also taught him that, you can look at the frog and tell what is the weather. If the frog was looking yellow, it means it's going to be sunny weather, it's going to be hot weather. If the frogs had turned brown, then that meant rain. So here we see that the child is really truly a naturalist. He is so enthused about his science class, about his teacher's lesson, and he is going back into that memory with so much happiness. So now we see that this is something very fascinating, that everybody, even the students who are now listening to this poem, your children in 11th and 12th grade, and there are also adults who are still reading this poem, we all have experienced that in our childhood we have rushed out into muddy waters to catch maybe little fish, to put them in bottles and call them our pets. I know that I have gone and I have dug in the most muddy patch to get earthworms, and I have collected those earthworms in bottles and brought them back to my own little patch of garden, knowing and believing and being so happy that the earthworms would make my little garden so fertile. The first time a third grade teacher told me that earthworms were what made the garden fertile, I went out in search for earthworms and I brought them into my garden. So every single child out there has played in mud. There is no little child who does not like mud. The sand, the beaches, anywhere where there is mud, you will see a little child digging with a little shovel, with a spoon, with a plate, filling up the jars with sticky mud and water. There is nothing as beautiful as mud and water. To make cakes, to decorate with shells, to make castles. So in the first paragraph, we see the child the child, the poet as a child, and his enthusiasm in science. But the name of this poem is Death of a Naturalist. So, is this about death? Are we going to see something about death? Or is it, I believe, it is a metaphorically, the poet is telling us how a naturalist or a science student is dying. Let us see. Then one hot day, when fields were rank with cow dung in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax-dam. I ducked through hedges to the coarse croaking that I had not heard. So now, once again, the poet, as a bigger child, he's grown up now, he's a teenager, an adolescent, a young adult who is going back to where he was once playing as a child, and he felt the fields were rank with heat. Cow dung filled the area, and instead of nimble tadpoles and nice jelly like Frogspawn, there were angry frogs. Angry frogs invaded the flax-dam. They had invaded that dam. The boy, he ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I had not heard. So now just compare the croaking in the first paragraph and now in the second paragraph. In the first paragraph, croaking was a beautiful sound, a sound of masculinity, of bravery. The daddy frog croaked, the frog spawn was born. It is something masculine, powerful, and something the child is filled with anticipation for. But now the coarse croaking is ugly, it's disgusting. It is frogs coming in to invade the area. The air was thick with a bass chorus. So there is a bass. Now look at the sounds that are coming: croaking, bass. Right down the dam, gross bellied frogs were cocked. On sods, their loose necks pulsed like sails. So now we see that there is a lot of usage of military words. Invaded. It is an army that will invade. And there is these words like bass chorus, then cocked. The word cocked is for a gun that is going to be used. On swords, their loose necks pulsed like sails. So now their loose necks are pulsing like sails. The entire image has changed to that of an army, something that is dangerous, no longer beautiful. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Now the poet says that there is something so obscene about the sounds that are made. So we can see the poetic device, onomatopoeia, is used because of all the sound effects, the croaking, the slap, the plop. All these show us, the sounds that are made, and obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned, and ran. So they were poised like mud grenades. They were actually being compared to bombs, and their blunt heads were farting. I sickened, turned, and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. And now the poet knew that if he dipped his hand into that frog spawn, they would just catch him, they would grab him. So here we see that the naturalist in our poet has died. He has been killed. Those huge frogs, the very language, the great slime kings. The frogs have suddenly become powerful. They are the great kings of slime. And they have scared our poet. They have made him run. Now the lines, I sickened, turned, ran. It's very fast. It shows swift action. The moment the author saw this, he felt sick to heart and he's run away. So, his expectation has been thwarted. Metaphorically, his expectations being thwarted is the death of the naturalist in him. The poem is made of just two small paragraphs or two small, paras, and this is in unrhymed iambic pentameter. It's blank verse. The devices used, as you see, is onomatopoeia. Then there is a metaphoric metaphor, of course. Then jam pots full of the jelly, alliteration. So J and J, there's alliteration. So yeah, there is a lot of negative words and a lot of positive words. So we also see that on one hand there is life, and one hand there is death. The frog spawn changing into frogs is definitely life happening, but the child who loses interest is having the naturalist in him dying. So this poem is so fascinating because it is talking about the passage from childhood into adolescence. It reminds us of Keats to autumn. To autumn, the poem in Ode to Autumn, Keats asks, "Oh spring, where is your song?" And he says that there is no song of spring to be heard. He then consoles autumn by saying, "You too have your own songs and you may sing." So this is quite similar to autumn. And if you take Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, we see that Wordsworth is talking to his sister Dorothy, and he tells her, "The light that once shone in my eyes, I see today in your eyes. The glee, the happiness that you show by looking at the moon and the nature, I see it and relive it again." I feel that Wordsworth has been a lot more positive in the sense that he has always been talking about the beautiful things about nature, and he says that nature has continued to be his. He says, "My nurse in my boyhood, my companion in my adulthood, my nurse, my carer, my muse." So, Wordsworth has had nature in all her facets all through his life. Then again, if we take, so many poets have worked with this idea of innocence and experience. It is something, so fascinating. If you take William Blake, Blake's Songs of Innocence, where he says, little lamb, dost thou know who made thee?" It is so innocent, so beautiful. And at the same time, when he talks about the tiger, the ferocious, destructive tiger, where he is asking the question, "Did the same God make thee?" You are suddenly transported into the world of adulthood. That world where, like Khalil Gibran says, you cannot return. The world of tomorrow, which only belongs to children. So this is the Malayalam poet in his poem Moham. Moham, the lines are, "ഒരു കുട്ടിയാകുവാൻ മോഹം, ഒരു ഒരു മയിൽപീലി ഇന്നു കാണുമ്പോൾ ഒരു കുട്ടിയായി മാറുവാൻ കവി ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നു. ആ മയിൽപീലി ഒരു പുസ്തകത്തിൽ വച്ച് അത് പെറ്റു പെരുകും എന്ന് ഓർക്കുവാൻ മോഹം." No adult, no grown up can think that a peacock feather will, give rise to more peacock feathers. No adult can be as thrilled as a child to catch a little fish from a pond, or, look at Frogspawn and say how beautiful. I think every little child has enjoyed nature in such a way to touch a forget me not and to jump with joy to see a butterfly and try to touch it and then get fascinated when it rises into the sky. So these are all those lands of childhood which once you are an adult you cannot visit. So this change from innocence to experience, that is what the poet is showing us. Now, Seamus Heaney is an Irish poet. He is known as one of the most prolific writers of Ireland that the world has ever known. He is Robert Lowell, the American poet, referred to him as the greatest Irish poet since Yeats. And all of Seamus Heaney's poems, almost all, deal with nature, with his childhood in Ireland, and also the themes of growing up, of becoming an adult. So always it is life and death. on either side, the cycle of life. So Seamus Heaney can also be called an American poet, for he was in USA for a very long period and he wrote a great many poems. This is one of a collection of more than 30 poems which came with the heading Death of a Naturalist, and this is one of the short poems in it, which is about Frogspawn. It is about a young boy collecting Frogspawn and later on going to the same spot and being revolted and wondering what made him ever like this activity. He was in Harvard and Oxford for a very long time, and he was a professor. He was the poet of Oxford, and later on also won the Nobel Prize. So yeah, so this is one of his very major poems. Seamus Heaney is also one another point that we can say is the very words like invaded, croaking, and pulsed, cocked. All those words that give us an in lexical and semantic way make us think about the army and invasion. Also shows us his Irish background. It is right after these poems came there was quite an unrest which was known as the Irish Troubles, and that sadness is also metaphorically given here. Ireland went through those troubles with its mother country or its neighbor. So that is also the pain of his motherland that grew up from her innocence. That too we can take as being portrayed here. You can compare this poem to so many other poems where innocence and experience is a major theme. Thank you. Word meanings from the poem Death of a Naturalist. Festered, become septic, heavy, full, bulky, rotted, decay, weighted, hold down, sweltered, uncomfortable, punishing, exhausting, discomforting. Gargle, wash one's mouth and throat with a liquid.